I'm Rod Rodriguez. This is Military Matters. One of the most common rules to podcasting is not to reveal the date the show was recorded. This is so you're not distracted by a Christmas message if you're listening in July. But this episode is a bit different. I think it's important that we tell you that this episode contains interviews recorded prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, that it was edited on February 27th with an intended release date of 1 March 2022. The crisis in Ukraine is moving quickly. Just a few minutes ago over Twitter, I saw a report that Ukrainian officials have agreed to hold talks with Russia at the Belarusian border. By the time March 1st rolls around, we could all be breathing a sigh of relief as the people of Ukraine begin the process of picking up the pieces and finding a new normal. On the other hand, no one knows what the next hour will bring, much less what the world will look like in a week. To help bring some perspective to the crisis and perhaps, more importantly, to add some historical context to the events in today's headlines, Jack Murphy brings us two interviews that could help bring into focus what we're seeing in the news and on social media. Ukraine is in the spotlight, but Russia kind of put it there. Jack Murphy takes us into this ongoing war, where it all really started, and where these experts think it's going.
The concept to do a deep dive on Russia, the way Military Matters did last season with China, is something that Rod and I had discussed for quite a while. But current events have overtaken us all, making this subject even more relevant. As I edited this episode, Russia formally acknowledged the breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine that they had helped rebel in 2014 and announced that they would now be occupied by the Russian military. The United States government responded by announcing additional sanctions. This comes after a series of escalating tensions between the United States and Russia over Ukraine that has taken place over the last 2 months. We've witnessed Russian belligerence, American deterrence, intentionally leaked intelligence reports, and declassified intelligence reports announced in official American press conferences. All of this comes as both Russia and the United States have mobilized military forces into Eastern Europe, the largest military buildup since the Second World War. Let's start this conversation today with Russia analyst Nick Trickett. Then a little later, we're going to hear from a former member of the Russian intelligence services who defected to the United States. Nick is a commodities analyst and a gas and oil consultant who specializes in Russia. With that said, let's get right into it. From America's point of view, Russia is Putin, Putin is Russia, end of story. What's really going on internally inside Russia from their own political standpoint?
It's important to think of Putin as someone who's built a system as opposed to an individual who can necessarily change everything on a dime. Like obviously he can make decisions much more quickly and change things. Like he can make a snap decision, but he has to appease, or at least work with various like interest groups that have helped him cement his power and cement the kind of political constituencies that keep him in power. And then obviously, most of those are elite constituencies, so it's not as much about making the public love you. But equally, the public can't totally hate you because going back to the early 2000s, the original idea was to build a party of power called United Russia that would effectively act as their arm in the legislature. And then, and it would allow for what we're referred to as kind of systemic opposition parties. So the Communist Party is a systemic, opposition party. The ostensible liberals who are not liberal at all are also systemically an opposition party, et cetera. They're allowed to have a place in the legislature and take place in debates and kind of have a back and forth and occupy some positions, but they can't veto what the regime wants as expressed through United Russia. Even though ostensibly things can be forced through by fiat, by executive decree and so on from the Kremlin, at every level, you still have lots of policy capture where businesses or interest groups are trying to make sure that their interests are protected. And on top of that, I think an important observation is that the bureaucracy is also often opposed in some respects to making things more efficient, right? So bureaucrats and people who've survived by earning off the state also have an interest in maintaining their role in distributing rents or in distributing money, et cetera. So it's nothing like a system where one person can actually just dictate the outcome every single time. And on top of that, it's also worth noting that a lot of times Putin will order things to happen, in the economy, let's say, not necessarily in foreign policy issues, but the economy and they'll just never come to pass. And no one comments on it, despite the repeated failure of government after government to hit their own targets. So I think that one way to think of it is that there's a mismatch in terms of the executive power to order, military or intelligence assets to do things versus what the executive can do to actually affect the economy and the economic base of the executive support. And that's true in the United States as well, right? I mean, obviously it's a very, very different context and much more extreme in terms of the centralization of power in Russia. But I think that Putin is someone who's built a system basically that he's now kind of captured by and has to sustain. Like, he can't retire because obviously he can only retire when he can find a way to build a system that protects him when he leaves power. And that's, obviously very difficult to do. How do you preserve the regime? And that process of preservation, obviously, it's increasingly like oppressive insofar as it's increasingly reliant on direct use of arrests, on making sure you censor different outlets, controlling the internet more and information space more amongst new media, and not delivering anything economically. And that's really where his power is weakest, ironically. So I think people have a distorted view of Putin's power because they only see the parts where the executive in any state would probably have the most power to unilaterally decide things.
So it really is a sort of interlocking oligarchy of elite interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference now is probably that more so than before Crimea, the oligarchs have no reason to break with him because the more we sanction Russia, the more reason the oligarchs have to basically act, as if their interests are aligned with the states, right? But the flip side is that they still have interests, and they still have to be kept rich. They still have, policy needs that get debated about constantly. It's a very, very dry subject, but one of the things you can do to kind of best understand what's happening is to look at, on a month-by-month basis, what the latest kind of reports are about plans to spend money to build things, basically. And you just see it steadily get revised down after like an initial idea, until they'll come out and say, we're spending like over 1 trillion rubles to build X thing, and throwing, let's say, at the rail system or something. But then it buried in the fine print will be that they're cutting more spending than that on other projects elsewhere that were promised. So, it's a system that also, and this is a more economic point, but that it's kind of hostage in that they're so terrified of inflation. Mm-hmm. And anytime inflation increases, as when we're seeing that in the U.S. and obviously now, as in terms of something that's a bit more close to home, but anytime inflation increases, they panic. And obviously the default is to pull more money out of the economy and to do less. And obviously that the net effect of that over time when you're an economy like Russia's, because it's still ultimately largely driven by resource exports, though not only, it's a much more complicated economy. Like the line that it's a gas station is not true. Gas stations, generally speaking, don't produce nuclear weapons and nuclear icebreakers. The effect is that they have to impose, stagnation and austerity in the public over time to kind of maintain the system they've built. And that's not necessarily going to lead to some regime collapse like the Soviet system, but it's not necessarily sustainable as it is. It's one of those things where they'll keep muddling on, but things are just getting worse below the surface as they muddle on.
So they're going to twist the knife in Ukraine because of some of the domestic issues that they're currently facing, but they're also hoping, is there a legitimate, from your point of view, a legitimate threat of increased territory expansion that they want Kiev within their borders? Is that a serious thing that they would consider?
So just to back up one sec, I should say that events in Ukraine are also really important for this. There were attempts from Zelensky, the president in Ukraine, to open up negotiations that then kind of fell flat because of domestic pressures he faced, and he's also tried to meet Putin personally, and Putin's kept rebuffing him. So I think so some of what's happening now is also that they realized, okay, we don't have a negotiating partner that can actually deliver for us in Ukraine, so we have to do something. So there's also that going on. To your question about expansion, no, I don't think. I think the only expansion that makes logical sense would be the land bridge linking Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, because that basically allows them to gain water supplies for Crimea because they've been shut off, and it makes it a bit cheaper to maintain Crimea as a territory, because obviously right now it being cut off and the fact they have to ship stuff in by sea, and the bridge they built helps some, but it was a really badly, it was a bit of a white elephant project. the rationale there makes sense. I think after that, I don't really see a logical, reason to gain territory. Obviously, they might think it makes sense for them to do it because it'll simply hurt the government and keep so much they have to negotiate, right? So that's possible. I don't think that of an all-out invasion in which they drive on Kyiv directly to the top of the government makes a lot of sense, primarily because being able to do something is different than being able to win the peace, right? Mm-hmm. So they could win the conflict probably without too much of a fight, even though I do expect that there'll be enough Ukrainians that are willing to sabotage them that it'll be a pain in the ass, for a while. And I would imagine that they're probably planning contingencies right now to do that. The bigger problem is that the only way they can make sure that the government signs the agreement they want is if they install that government, and once they install that government, the public's obviously going to reject it. And the next thing you know, they have to act as the kind of like the armed police for a regime that is not popular and is not wanted, and also one that has technically inherited an existing set of obligations to the EU that are already in place. So, for example, like you can't take away, like Ukrainians have visa-free access to the EU at this moment, and Russia taking that away from them is going to suck, right? Especially given how many migrant Ukrainian laborers went to Poland, for instance. So, it's hard to game out a scenario in which Russia strategically gains anything from doing that. And the problem with annexing territory is that the amount that it gets them strategically to do so is so small compared to the obvious escalation in sanctions and tensions, and the fact that all they're doing is basically solidifying NATO when it was otherwise dying in terms of its relevance.
Right.
And all they're doing is giving Ukrainians who used to be much more sympathetic to Russia every reason to hate them. So it's like I think of it as a massive own goal, especially because of it was minor, but the very appearance of interference in the 2016 election in the U.S. meant that it would become a domestic issue in the U.S., which means that we would always hate them.
Let's hear an alternative perspective on Ukraine from Jan Neumann. Jan is a former Russian FSB counterintelligence officer who was appointed by the Russian government to supervise a multi-billion-dollar money laundering operation for the state. He later defected from Russia. He was then brought to the United States by U.S. governmental organizations. He was then a consultant for a variety of U.S. governmental agencies, helping them with investigations related to Russian intelligence, money laundering, and the fight against Eurasian organized crime groups.
Well, first of all, about the Ukraine. For me, it's really kind of personal because I had, back in days, I had a lot of friends in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot of, and it's not a secret that a bunch of the Russians, and I don't want to throw any numbers, I just don't know them, but let's say theoretically about 15 or 20 million Russians, they do have families in Ukraine or family ties to Ukraine. Lots of the Ukrainians going to work to Russia on like yearly as a seasonal workers and do some construction work and such. A lot of them relocated to Russia during the beginning, after the 2014, when the revolution or coup or mutiny happened basically political system changed in Ukraine in 2014. Close to like 2.5-3 million people went to Russia. Ukraine is always, Russia never considered Ukraine as an enemy, is what I remember. I was visiting Ukraine when it was Soviet Union, and then I was later during the 90s and the early 2000s. I never had any tensions, any problems with the language or people knew you're coming from Russia. And kind of, it was more like you basically just driving within this kind of a big brotherhood state, right? So we're not just neighbors. We literally just one nation, one country, one same people. I'm not talking about the western part of Ukraine, but I was primarily on the eastern side of it, and plus the Azov Sea, and then the Black Sea itself, and Odessa, for example, and then Crimea. So kind of, it was no, even visually or mentally or culturally, any kind of difference between you in Russia or you're there. It felt absolutely the same. The car plates slightly different, but language is the same, people are the same, everything is the same. Ukraine till 2014, Ukraine was playing with both sides. So at the same time, they had the military drills with NATO and it was happening like from early, whatever it is, late 90s or mid 90s. And at the same time, they've been business partners with Russian military industrial complex, right? So Ukraine's been producing a lot of parts like engines for helicopters, and they've been doing a lot of small things like IT stuff for Russian missiles. They've been building the turbines for Russian ships and such. So this was kind of full-scale cooperation. People have been going back and forward. I personally do believe that Ukraine got absolutely insane and phenomenal geopolitical location. They're right in a spot between the West and East. They have access to sea. Ukraine potentially could have been like a Eastern European Switzerland, just my opinion. They have really nice and mild kind of a climate compared to Russia. So it's close to the same thing as in Poland or in Germany. They have absolutely, they have natural resources. They have their own gas, by the way. They have minerals. They have ore. They have coal. They have the perfect transportation hub between the goods, for goods which is supposed to, which potentially can go from the China through Russia to Europe, and Ukraine just can work and have it all. So in Russian head, and again, what we saw, we thought that Ukraine can potentially use it and be really successful, prosperous, and really rich country itself. But they're supposed to just stay as neutral as possible. Don't go into any military bloc with Russia. So don't do anything with the West. Just be yourself, make money, be happy. Like, honestly, you guys in the best spot in Europe you can imagine. Like, because there's two titans, like whole European industries, and then you have Russians and Chinese. So, and I guess that was pretty okay for Russians, what's going on in Ukraine. So you guys been dealing with the East and West, and they saw it as a hub. And then Ukrainian people, whether it's Ukrainian elites, try to change the way country going. So they decided to go directly, maybe towards more west, and then join the NATO. And from this moment, Russians immediately felt as a threat. So that's why they took Crimea. Because Crimea, if you control Crimea, you control the whole Black Sea. No Crimea, no Black Sea. That's pretty simple. That's ultimately unsinkable air carrier standing in the middle of the Black Sea. If you have it, you're going to control the whole area. It doesn't matter how many ships Turkey have, or Romania, or Bulgaria, or anyone else. As long as you have Crimea, you're going to control it all. So, and that's why they decided to take it over, because they thought that next step will be NATO might take it over. Again, it's my opinion. I'm not in Kremlin. I have nothing to do with Russian politics, but this is how I saw it. So they really were afraid that they're going to lose it. So they took it over. And they also saw Ukraine, again, my opinion, it was like a perfect, like a no man's land or buffer zone between the East and West, more like a safety zone for everyone, right? So so NATO is really close to Russian borders, but at the same time, you still have this huge gap, like as Ukrainian territory. And if you look up, there is the same type of buffer zone as Belarus, between the Russia and the NATO. They're right in the middle. So, and now if NATO is taking completely Ukraine, Russians most likely going to feel really unsafe and insecure because NATO is coming literally next to their borders. And I guess that's why we have all this mess. They just, they feel that they can't lose it. And the only reason is because it's their own like national security issues, and they can't give up on this piece of territory that easy. And they for sure they don't want to see NATO in it.
What do you see as the spark for this latest conflict, this latest bit of tension in Ukraine? Because there was no threat that Ukraine was going to join NATO now, not with, they can't, with Russia controlling some of their territory. I mean, what is this latest conflict in 2022 about?
Let me try to find some polite words how to explain it. Again, as I said, I'm taking this really personal, and I really upset that what's going on. And
that's okay.
Yeah, I wish it would have been no conflict in Ukraine, because I consider them as basically as a family, And even being here in States, I have several friends that are from Ukraine, even from Western Ukraine, and we are really best buddies. So we never had any problems. So I guess it's overall feeling that they're losing it. That may be the right answer, because it's clear that Ukraine is drifting towards the West, at least the political elites and the way they see the future of the Ukraine itself. So maybe problem was with that some Western countries brought their advisors or started to train Ukrainian military forces, or have got they've been doing some military installations on Ukraine soil. All of this showed the Russians that at some point they will lose it completely. So not just like immediately Ukraine is going to join the NATO, that's done deal. They know that's not going to happen, but it's like a slow integration into the NATO, and then finally everything will be just a part of the NATO. So I guess they just really don't like it, and they decided to stop it. And if you look, just be like for a second the devil's advocate, right? Look from their perspective. They had this safety zone, and it was okay for them. They were not doing anything, and then within several months or days, it's all just turned upside down. They lost it. What you can do in this case? Imagine if, let's say, Russia or China would have changed political system or helped, let's say, motivate local people, let's say in Ireland, and then they're going to put their own instructors to Dublin and going to tell them, it's going to say that, okay, Ireland is going to join the Russian military union. How quick Brits will do something in it, how quick they will engage, and it's going to be an absolute disaster for Britain. So I guess here has happened the same thing, even if it's no like direct threat, but they feel it. It's hypothetical. It's future. It's coming, and they want to fix it. Again, as I said, I just hope, even with all of this tension, I hope that all will be resolved without any war. No one will be dead or shot or whatever has happened. So, and everything will go as smooth as possible, just like it was during the Caribbean crisis, when like one big meeting and basically it's all over.
Let's get back to Nick Trickett for some deeper analysis on why Russia fears NATO encirclement. From when I read about like these fears that Russia has of NATO encirclement, now, I mean, to some extent, I understand if Russia was on our Canadian and Mexican borders, we'd be freaking out about that. But on the other hand, it also seems that there's this like profound Russian paranoia that NATO tanks are going to rush across the steppes to Moscow. And it's just something that's like, I mean, I get there's a larger geopolitical context, but I mean, there's also a certain amount of paranoia when I read about these things. I mean, what do you think is going on in the minds of the Russian government or Putin himself when they talk about NATO and NATO encirclement? What are their real concerns there?
I think my basic point would be that obviously NATO is not, as an alliance, is not going to attack Russia. But going back to the Turkish example, members can do things that are escalatory in specific theaters that make it harder for Russia to operate. So that's a specific risk, right? Now, obviously, like Ukraine, Russia is very different than like Syria and the Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, I guess now technically, sorry, but that's a general problem, right? I think the other thing that I would say is that even if the odds of a NATO invasion of Russia are like infinitesimally small, like 0.0001%, if you're a security planner thinking about force posture, you still have to be able to deal with that eventuality because they're on your border and they're big as an alliance, and the U.S. is big, right? So that's a problem. I mean, it's a resource drain regardless of the actual direct threat that NATO poses, and I think that really, I mean, people debate about which transgression of international norms was the moment when Russia broke over NATO. I think that's kind of stupid. I think it's pretty obvious that Iraq was really the biggest turning point, because that was a next level compared to Kosovo. But I think that the lesson that I would draw is that when you go back and look at stuff in the 90s, even the liberals in Russia were very adamant that Russia had privileged interests in Eurasia. I mean, even Kozyrev, the kind of erstwhile, liberal foreign minister during Yeltsin's first term, who was frankly not that good a diplomat, but and not really good internally. Like he was despised by a lot of Russians for failing to assert their national interests. Even he wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs early on, basically saying that that we were heading towards a multipolar world, and that Russia had privileged interest in its sphere of influence, and the U.S. would have to acknowledge those in its dealings with Russia, and we just didn't. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating a bit because I do think that Russian paranoia is a huge part of the story, and I'm of two minds on NATO expansion because you also obviously if the issue is people applying to join, and then the fix would be to renegotiate the terms under which people can join, not to complain about the fact that small states next to Russia decided to apply. And that's a more complicated process. When we're talking about like Ukraine, for instance, and potential membership in the future, but I think it's not. I don't think it's just paranoia. I mean, I do think they've always had like a deep-seated idea that this region, which was still interconnected in many ways, right? So it was also a set of countries that used to be one economy in one country, that also often moved between each other in terms of population and so on. They had reasons to be linked. Now the paranoia part, I think, has more to do with the failure to realize the political constraints on action that American or other politicians face in democracies. That it took a concerted campaign in 2002 to get to Iraq. It wasn't like a president just unilaterally decided I'm doing this. Like there were so many bureaucratic things that had to be done in a specific manner, and individuals appointed and so on to get to a certain place. So I think that's ironically something that Russia might have learned from the way that Biden managed to withdraw from Afghanistan was his ability to actually defeat the bureaucracy in that regard. But I think that's one thing that sticks out to me. I think another thing that sticks out to me in terms of that tanks on Moscow scenario. I mean, you're talking about leadership in a society that still remembers its own collapse in some respect, right? And it remembers its own collapse at a point in time when it was weak. It felt, many people to this day obviously feel like Gorbachev just conceded too much at the end and failed. And many people obviously blame him for bringing the Soviet Union to its knees, probably rightly overall. And there's this sense of, being taken advantage of because of that traumatic event that lingers. So there is an element of kind of revenge or whatever you want to call it that's there. But I don't think that when they talk about Ukraine or NATO expansion that it's entirely paranoid, because ultimately they're planning for contingencies, because obviously if they know and recognize that their interests conflict with ours and with NATO members, then obviously it's a problem for them when people join. That's just the basic tenet of statecraft. And I think that it's one of the problems that in the U.S. we suffer from is that we don't want to admit that they have interest because we inherently see them as illegitimate, and it doesn't really matter if they're legitimate or not; they still have them.
Let's get back to Jan here. Sometimes it's easy for Americans to overlook the root causes for what motivates the Russian people and their government, as we have no real experience with the type of historical trauma that their nation has suffered. You once pointed out to me that, and I thought this is very telling, and it's important to talk about from a Russian perspective, that the Soviet Union, whatever its flaws were, people felt that they had a country, that they were moving in a certain direction, that there was something that they were fighting for. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this feeling that, I lost my country.
Jack, collapse of the Soviet Union was basically brought more damage than maybe the World War II on the Russian soil. Overall human losses as a casualties almost were the same. So the whole country just fell apart. Families fell apart. Some cities just ceased to exist because the industries and factories been closed, and it was absolute mess. People who were everything, let's say professors or scientists or teachers or engineers, military personnel. They had stable life. They knew about it was a well-planned future. They had bright future for their kids, and overnight, it all was just gone. That's it. Everything went completely south, and the country turned into the wasteland with the kind of Wild West elements in it, with the huge gang wars all around the country. So it was a tragedy, it was a disaster, and especially imagine how heavy it was for Russians. So within 100 years period, they lost country twice. 1917,
Bolshevik
absolute
Revolution.
disaster, yes. The Bolshevik coup, October coup, and then civil war for like 4 years, which destroyed almost everything. It was a Western countries' intervention. Then it was industrialization process where they tried to rebuild the whole thing, and they actually were able to do so. Yes, it was absolutely bloody. I guess it was the bloodiest period in Russian history. All this great purge and repressions, but they were able to prepare a country for Nazi invasion. So they had only like 18 years to prepare, and they succeed. They've been able to fight the war and win the war, of course, with allies' help, with the Lend-Lease support and such. But they took the main impact from the Nazis as well, and it cost them 27 million people, which is another huge punch to the country. Then they've been rebuilding this, resetting this. It's again a lot of blood, sweat, a lot of lost lives, and then 70 years later, ultimately the whole country collapsed again, was divided on smaller pieces. So I guess they kind of, overall Russians, they don't want to anything like that happen to the country again. That's why they're looking for, the only main goal is just stability, try to avoid any potential war, like on a global scale. They have some kind of a potential future right now. And that's why they want to kind of save it, secure it. They don't want anyone else, like the two guys before, run the country, like the person who lost the Soviet Union, who was a dreamer and, in my opinion, slightly incompetent leader. And the second guy who was in the 90s, it was a godfather of Russian corruption, as you wish, Yeltsin. So which is not a big secret at all. And he was the guy who was behind the privatization and loans for shares and such. So now the guy who is basically a crisis manager, that's the only thing he can do. He's doing everything in manual mode. So, and he took the country when it was almost on the edge of another civil war and on the edge of the collapse. So Russia was supposed to be ceased to exist in the late 90s. And I was right in service in this moment, and it was in the air. That country might sustain a few years more, but this is pretty much it. And then I don't know what happened, but the country was able to survive.
Americans don't really understand that, do they, Jan? Like the sort of national trauma that Russians have been through.
Huge, guys. I mean, the casualties, just losses itself. If you put together, let's say 1917, the First World War I, right? A lot of casualties for Russia. They've been fighting. Then Russian Revolution and the Civil War, which was going like for 4.5 years. Then industrialization plus the Great Purge and all these repressions within. Then World War II with the 27 million losses. Then sort of stability for at least like 30, 40 years. And then everything went down immediately overnight, 90s, 91, 92. Just look at this. That's absolute tragedy. And it's, I don't know how to explain it. And kind of my family and kind of, we went through all of these things. And it was a huge impact on everyone, and people, they don't want to repeat it again. Plus, every time it was a huge humiliation. Same thing happened in 1917, then the same thing happened in the 90s. When at the same moment you can feel like I was a kid, like you grew up in this idea that you are part of something really big. You are a citizen of this huge monster country, which is the largest country on the planet with insane military capabilities and a bunch of the resources. You only have like a bright future. If you're not paying attention to this ideological crap, overall, like you're part of something big, right? So it's not a communist idea, it's just part of the big country with a lot of nationalities in it, and it's pretty safe and stable. And then it's gone. And then it's not just gone, and everyone has started to talk and bring some information how bad it was, and just kind of it's completely changing your mind and your view on things, how they were. And then absolute disaster for about what is it, like 1989 up to 2000s, early 2000s. So yeah, it's if you never, and I hope US will never face anything like that. That's just that's kind of my wish, and that's what I want. In Russia we say there are some things which you can't even wish to your enemies. So I really don't want any country and anyone go through what Russia went through within this like 100 years time period.
The first problem is I think that there's not really been any effort to educate the public on just how extreme the collapse of the state was in the 90s. I think it's hard. It really is hard to this has to be stressed. I mean, the state ceased to function.
They lost their country, and it traumatized.
Yeah, like in a very basic. Yeah, in a very basic way, the state ceased to function, and so when various reforms were pursued right out the gate, including easing up like capital controls, you get money in and out. The reason why FSB guys suddenly surge in influence is because these are guys that have experience working abroad and have foreign contacts, and suddenly they're the ones who have to negotiate the imports for food because the country's short of food, and try to get the money in to feed people. Like, it wasn't just like greed and evil. It was very practical considerations of like they were short of basic consumer goods, they were short of food, et cetera, and they experienced a massive recession for years and years. So like a massive fall off in living standards and so on, and then state ministries ceased to function effectively in many cases, and they had to be rebuilt over time, and that's even setting aside the very problem of like Yeltsin shelling parliament to give himself power to prevent a kind of unending back and forth within democratic systems, so that there was more stability, which obviously in hindsight was a terrible choice, but what felt urgent at the time. So I think that's one thing to start from, that like it's that the corruption that people are pointing to and talk about all the time, it doesn't evolve in some kind of like vacuum of like guys chain smoking cigars, wearing turtlenecks, and like scheming. Like when the state's not providing basic services, people step in to provide them, right? And that's a basic tenet in any scenario. You see that happen in the U.S. in some cities, though obviously not in the same way, the same scale necessarily. A lot of the corruption in Russia is not really illegal. It's stuff that's been legalized, and that's important to get your head around. That it's not people as much people stealing money, through illegal means. Even the bribery is obviously still a commonplace, and people still try to take shortcuts around stuff. But it's rather that there are illegal means by which people can extract tons of money out of the public, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to basically just allow the contractors that the state hires to build something, et cetera, to massively inflate the costs and then pocket the difference. That's an easy one. And no law's been broken. The laws that are broken are in that case are actually about competition, because you might have one guy literally register 10 different companies that he owns all of them, but they're bidding against each other for this contract. But the larger point is that it's not necessarily the outright theft as much as it might seem. It's more about things structurally being designed to hand money to different elites to keep things going. In the same way that like in the early 2000s, as Putin was consolidating his power, he had to basically make a deal with organized crime to just get violence down on the streets and so on, and to impose some kind of order. So the deal basically being, we're not going to stop you making a profit, but you're not doing X thing, Y thing, B thing, et cetera. They kind of established rules for what was acceptable, what wasn't. And over time, incorporated organized crime into the state. So they actually use them for foreign policy uses as well as domestic stuff. I think a third thing that comes to mind is, back to earlier, is that Russia's not a gas station. Russia was not a petrostate, that then built up an economy. It was an industrialized economy that got rich, that started exporting oil for money in mass in the 60s, basically. So it's a very different situation than like Saudi Arabia. You have an economy that already has this large industrial base that's really inefficient and needs a lot of investment. That eventually becomes dependent on money being transferred from the oil sector to industry. And the real problem that happens in the Soviet period is that eventually, they mismanage fields, they don't explore enough, et cetera, that it gets more and more expensive to maintain oil output. And it gets harder and harder to transfer that money. So it's not as straightforward a story of Putin's economy recreating this dynamic, even though in the 2000s that's what was going on. It's a country that, as a professor of mine joked, can build nuclear icebreakers, but is really bad at making TV sets. And I think that this colors the way we think of a lot of what Russia does, because oil and gas lend themselves to like geopolitical chicanery. People like to imagine the idea of like leaders having their hand in the spigot and just choosing what happens. And like, there's obviously an element of truth to that, but that's really not how oil and gas work. And so Russia's not that. And I think the last thing that's to stress, there's always more, I'm sure, is the stability of the leadership of the country, right? The idea that Putin and the people closest to him have been in power for decades now, does not mean that the country's stable. It's a dynamic place. Things are always changing. Like art is being created. There are new fads. Fashion does exist, even if it's like outdated when you go to like outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but it's not just dynamic in the sense of like people live normal lives there. It's, and people, I think in the US in particular, tend to forget that life in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states is actually pretty similar to life in democracies for the most part, because your life's mundane and you aren't constantly protesting on the street. It's also that the process of the leadership maintaining that power is dynamic. So they constantly the regime is constantly trying to find new ways to manage public opinion, to pay off a certain elite body, or to figure out who should be controlling what asset, and so on. So like, I think it's vastly, exaggerated the extent to which it's like stable. I think that people have this idea that Putin's just there in that sense and it's stable, and it's just not. It's a constant balancing act that he's been really, really good at, and has actually removed himself from over time to some extent, because he hasn't really given a shit, frankly, about domestic policy for like most of the last decade. But it's something that he still has to do it. It's not like he's not defying gravity, which I think people tend to assume. There's this kind of cult that assume that he's more powerful.
How long do you see this sort of renewed Russian belligerence, shall we say, going on? I mean, if we I don't want to use, kind of like a crass term, like this is the new Cold War 2.0, but whatever that's
China.
Yeah, exactly. But whatever this resurgence is in Russian belligerence in various parts around the world and in regards to America, and how long do you see this phase of our diplomatic relations going on?
I see a kind of status quo kind of persisting for the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, I think things have about bottomed out. There's not much more they can really do without risking like a serious attack on our part. And I think that they've kind of realized, if you track what's happening with the negotiations over Ukraine, as an outsider, not necessarily, talking to people who are like there, but just reading between the lines, you get the sense that there's a realization in the Kremlin that Ukraine was kind of their own red line moment. They set themselves up to do what Obama did, and like Obama, now they're like, oh, this is not worth it. I have to find a way out. And obviously, whether they do or not, it's an open question. So I don't do predictions because with this stuff, because it's all BS. Everyone's going to 60-40 it so they can sound smart no matter what happens. And it's not really, at some point analytically, it's dishonest. But I think the bigger point is that they know that there are serious constraints on what they can actually achieve, and they've probably achieved as much as they can. So I don't see them becoming conciliatory. I do see the kind of material constraints of what they can achieve, creating a situation in which they're going to try to keep finding ways to negotiate. But of course, for them, that's probably going to be triggered by threatening something so that we talk to them instead of ignoring them. We are trying to get some kind of agreement about like verification of forces, if nothing else, and just ways to kind of diffuse some of the tensions. They stop panicking about us putting, like more aggressive systems and so on in place in neighboring countries. But I see them kind of hitting a dead end because of the political economy also of what they've done. In some sense, like I think confrontation is probably here to stay, but I think it's confrontation with the intention of trying to find some new diplomatic normal. I don't buy the idea that they can go much further. I mean, I think the fact that they demanded the crazy things about NATO, like, taking troops out of Bulgaria and Romania, to some extent reflected paranoia. It to some extent reflected the idea that they wanted to make this Ukraine standoff a much bigger issue in terms of what it was meant to do. But it also meant that they're trying to throw out crazy stuff so that the middle is acceptable.
Let's say the ideal, I can say only about the ideal case scenario. Maybe some big guy is going to have a meeting and they're going to make a decision that Ukraine will be the Eastern European version of Finland. That's it. Mm-hmm. You're not part of any military bloc. We're all going to help you. East and West is going to help you to rebuild your economy, which will be the safest option for everyone. Like basically like joint, whatever it is, Marshall Plan applied between the Russia and Americans and Europeans to Ukraine. They will be completely neutral, and it will be just a major economical hub for Europe. That's it. That would be maybe the best case scenario. Mm-hmm. Everything, but it's a miracle. I'm not sure it's going to happen. As for kind of a global perspective, I still believe, maybe I'm naive, that US and Russia never going to fight as an open war, because these two countries can destroy everything and everyone. That's the only, I guess, that's the safety thing we have in relation between the Russia and US. That because both countries know what they can do, they're never going to fight. As for Ukraine, again, as I said, unfortunately, it's not up to Ukraine. It's up to big guys, and we don't know what they're going to come up with. And I just hope they can make something smart out of it. They already have past experience how to do it. And I just hope they can go back to the old books and just maybe apply to the same thing as they've done back in the 60s. So without creating any kind of new mess and any tension.
Folks, it could all be very different by the time you hear this podcast, so please bear with us. There are enough people out there fear-mongering and warmongering. We don't want to participate in any of that. We just hope to present information about how we got to this point and explain the background and history that has led us here. Ultimately, you're going to have to make up your own mind. But I hope that cooler heads prevail and that this conflict is avoided entirely. In the end, a military incursion into Ukraine does not serve American or Russian interests. It certainly doesn't help the people of Ukraine, who will suffer the most. We've got a couple more episodes in this series lined up to discuss Russia's intelligence services and military at greater length and depth. I'm Jack Murphy for Military Matters.
This episode was written by Jack Murphy and produced by Rod Rodriguez. Don't forget to check out stripes.com for the latest news that matters to you. Use promo code podcast and get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes. That's 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And as always, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Rod Rodriguez. We'll see you at the next episode.